This is Fire and Fate by Serena Valentino. Chapter 2. The Breaking of the Worlds. The worlds had been broken many times, by the gods and by witches, and by blundering humans dabbling in magic they didn't understand. This was the day the worlds broke so violently, even the god Hades didn't know if he could repair them. But as you will soon learn, Hades was the only being who could put things right, because he tangled our fates together, binding us in ways we never thought possible. If you have read the other stories from the Book of Fairy Tales, you know this wasn't Hades' first visit to the many kingdoms, but it was the first time Hazel and Primrose would make his acquaintance. Hundreds of years after his visit to the many kingdoms, and longer still after he took the throne in the underworld. On that day, Hazel and Primrose stood in the courtyard in the shadow of the ancient stone mansion that was perched on the tallest hill in the Dead Woods, contemplating the history of their kingdom and the events that made them queens of this land. The queens of the dead had ruled this realm for longer than time itself. Before Hazel and Primrose's reign, the queens of the Dead Woods were known for their cruelty and unfathomable necromantic powers. They demanded all the dead from the surrounding villages be buried in their kingdom so that they might take dominion over them. Those who didn't comply with their demands were slaughtered and brought into the undead ranks of the Dead Woods. The queen's necromantic powers and secrets of extraordinary long life were passed down to each new generation, mothers to daughters. The lore is steeped in blood and trauma, and the kingdom remained a bleak and deadly place until Hazel and Primrose, daughters of the previous queen, took their place as rulers in the haunted realm. Hundreds of years prior, Hazel and Primrose lived in the Dead Woods as children with their sister Gothel and their mother Manea, queen of the dead. When they all came of age, they were expected to accept their mother's blood so her power would be passed down to them. When Hazel and Primrose refused, their mother tried to force it upon them, giving Gothel no choice but to kill her own mother. So the Wraith Queen Manea took revenge on Primrose and Hazel, killing them and leaving Gothel alone, desperate to find a way to bring her sisters back from the dead. For many years, even after Gothel's death, Primrose and Hazel slept the sleep of the dead, until one day they were revived and made their way back to the only home they knew, the Dead Woods. There, they became friends and allies with Circe, and joined her in the fight against her mothers, Lucinda, Ruby, and Martha, who wanted to rule the Dead Woods and bring darkness and terror to all the realms. The Odd Sisters were so deranged at this point they had lost all sense of reason, and their hearts were only filled with hate. It had been a slow process bringing them to this state, but it seemed their madness had been fated from the beginning. When the Odd Sisters were much younger, they had a little sister named Circe, whom they loved more than anything. She was their everything, their shining star, their greatest love, and they held her even more dear than their own lives. One day, she was tragically taken from them in a heartbreaking accident, the day Maleficent turned into a dragon and burned the fairylands in a fit of rage and sorrow. The Odd Sisters didn't blame Maleficent, but in their grief they made it their mission to create another sister by devising a spell that would use the best parts of themselves. They used old and dangerous magic created by the queens of the dead, magic to create daughters. And that is what they did. They created a daughter from blood and magic without knowing it. Without knowing it would slowly erode everything that was good within them, eventually turning them mad. But they had their Circe back, and they called her sister rather than daughter, and never told her the truth of her origins. Then one day, many years later, Circe, with the help of Snow White, learned about the Odd Sisters, what the Odd Sisters had done. Circe learned the Odd Sisters had given too much of themselves in the creation of her, and it had turned them into fiendish witches just as vile as the queens of the dead. Circe felt she had no other choice than to sacrifice herself, in hopes it would return to the Odd Sisters what they had lost in creating her. And through this act, the Odd Sisters and Circe went to the place between the living and the dead, where Circe could keep watch on her mothers until she decided what to do. It had been several weeks since Circe took her own life to save all of theirs, and Hazel and Primrose waited in hope that Circe would return to them. But as more time passed, they started to lose faith and slipped farther into despair. Hazel and Primrose were now left with nothing but their own grief. The Dead Woods felt even lonelier now that Snow White had gone home to her own kingdom. Circe and Snow were cousins, good friends, and the best of companions. She stood alongside Circe, Primrose, and Hazel during the battle with the Odd Sisters, and mourned Circe's death profoundly. But there was nothing Snow could do to bring her friend back, no matter how much love she had in her heart or how many tears she shed. She was needed back at home with her family, so after a tearful goodbye, she pulled away in her carriage, promising to write Primrose and Hazel as soon as she reached her own kingdom. When Primrose and Hazel watched Snow's carriage pull out from the courtyard amongst the weeping angels and ancient crypts, their sorrow swept over them like a torrent. They had lost Circe, and now Snow White was on her own way home. Feeling their losses deeply, Hazel and Primrose thought the entirety of the dead woods shared in their sorrow. Even the Gorgon statue near the fountain, under the mossy oak, and the stone creatures perched on the massive mansion seemed to be weeping that day, while the caws of the crows in the branches of the newly blossoming trees sang a song of grief. "Hazel, look at this," said Primrose. "The trees are showing their colors, and the moss is green rather than gray. How is that possible?" Her eyes sparkled with wonder, and just the hint of happiness on this sad day. "This may be a place for the dead, but it needn't be a dead place." Hazel's words reminded Primrose of the waking dream she'd had about a mysterious man named James who visited them in the dead woods. He flashed in her mind just as vividly as he had originally appeared, and she wondered if the dream hadn't been a vision of something that would come to pass. But she was too distracted just then, realizing the meaning of Hazel's words. "You did this? With your magic? Why didn't I think of that?" Primrose looked around at the green leaves and tiny colorful blooms in the trees. It reminded her of when they were children, and she would tie ribbons with colorful hearts on the decayed tree branches. It had been her way of bringing color and life into the dead place. It made her heart happy to realize that they had the power to alter the dead woods, however they wished. They were the queens of the dead now, and she felt for the first time that she would be happy there. And she was more convinced than ever that her waking dream was a glimpse into the future. "Circe would love this," Primrose said with a wave of her hand, and the red blooms grew bigger and more vibrant, the color of blood. Then suddenly the memory of Circe's gruesome death flashed in her mind with a violence that sent pain throughout her entire body. "I can't get the image of Circe's death out of my mind. I think it's going to haunt me forever. But Hazel, I have a strange feeling she's coming home. Do you think that's possible?" "I'm not sure. Taking her own life stopped her mother's from destroying this land and countless others. The Odd Sisters seem happy in the place between themselves again, but I'm not sure if Circe will be able to talk them into going beyond the veil. I don't know what's going to happen." Primrose didn't seem convinced. "I don't know, Hazel. I think I had a vision of the future. We were all laughing together. You, me, and Circe. We were chatting with a strange and charming man who traveled from across the sea to bring us an enormous cake, and we couldn't stop laughing." Primrose was laughing now even at the thought of it. This man with his unusual but dashing clothing, a flashy mustache, and an unmistakably good heart. "I'm sure it was you who couldn't stop laughing, but why would he travel all the way just to bring us a cake?" asked Hazel. "It was a really big cake, but there was more to it. Circe asked him to stay in the dead woods. We all did, but we couldn't convince him to stay. Everything was so different in my vision. The Rapunzel flowers were everywhere, scattered across the many kingdoms, and the dead woods were filled with so much life. Even Mrs. Tittlebottom was young again. Maybe we should look at the book of fairy tales and see if it's true. I think the man's name was James. Maybe his story is on our shelves." Hazel sighed. "I thought you were afraid to look at the book. As a rule, we don't read stories that haven't happened yet. Circe says one day we will see time the way she does, all at once, and I think it's starting to happen to me now with these visions. Why not take a look? Besides, we found James delightful, and reading his story might be a lovely diversion." Primrose always counted on her optimism to be infectious, which it often was, but Hazel wasn't budging. "She also says she keeps herself tethered to one timeline so she doesn't lose her mind. Perhaps we should just wait and see what happens. It can be something to look forward to." Primrose wondered if her sister was right. "Come on, Hazel, we're witches. We're supposed to know the future. What will it hurt? If we had read all of the stories about Circe in the book of fairy tales, she might still be alive. She might be with us right now. Or things could be a lot worse. Come on, let's go back inside and have a cup of tea and a slice of Snow's gooseberry pie. She made more pies than we could possibly eat, because you said you loved them so much." This made Primrose smile. She had grown to love Snow and missed her already, even though she had just left. At least she had her pies. As Primrose and Hazel were about to make their way back inside, they were distracted by the blinding pale blue light, so bright that they were sure it could be seen all around the many kingdoms. The light took the shape of a swirling blue vortex, blazing like a hot flame, causing everything in the dead woods to stir and the dead within their graves to wake from their slumber. One by one the dead emerged from their crypts and from under the ground where they slept, brushing the dirt and dust from their clothes and squinting against the sunlight in their eyes. It had been years since Primrose and Hazel laid eyes on the army of the dead at their disposal. Not since the time of their mother had they been summoned in this way, and the two women didn't understand what power was springing them to life once more. For centuries the queens before them had been hoarding a legion of dead beneath them, and now these poor souls were standing before Primrose and Hazel, their queens, silently awaiting their command. But Hazel and Primrose didn't understand why. Their manservant, their protector and champion, their dearest friend, Jacob, once raised from the dead himself, entered the garden and watched the dead coming to life before them. "Jacob, what's going on? Why is this happening?" But Primrose could see the look on Jacob's face, and he didn't know either. Like most witches, Primrose could read minds, and she heard Jacob's thoughts. He was panic-stricken. He feared the Odd Sisters had found their way out of the place between and had come back to destroy them. Primrose felt terrible for Jacob, for everything he experienced over the years in the name of loyalty to the queens of the dead, and she could see it was taking a toll on him. One day, she would read his story in the book of fairy tales. She was sure there was more to his tale besides what was documented in the chapter dedicated to the Odd Sisters, but that would be a good place to begin. "Don't worry, Jacob, this is not the Odd Sisters' magic. I do not feel them among us." Primrose squinted against the bright light of the vortex as a form began to emerge from within. No, this was someone entirely unexpected, someone far more powerful. As the form took shape and shifted into focus, they suddenly knew who this legendary god was. He appeared uncharacteristically silent and solemn, his eyes blazing yellow against the pale blue skin. His cloak swirled in plumes of smoke that moved like tentacles, stretching out like a great smoldering leviathan. His hair blazed blue fire, and in his arms was Circe, her skin glowing blue from the light of the vortex behind them. "Circe!" Hazel's gray eyes flashed as she rushed toward Circe, Primrose following close behind her. Hades grinned at the witches as he gingerly draped Circe's body on the marble steps of a nearby crypt. Her long red gown swayed in the current of the vortex like waves of blood. "I wasn't expecting such a deliciously gruesome welcome," Hades said, gesturing to the endless rows of dead assembled in the courtyard, reaching all the way back through the woods to the tall rosebush thicket that surrounded their kingdom. The dead stared at Hades with hollow eyes. They were not sparkling with life like the eyes of Sir Jacob, who took his place between Primrose and Hazel and grasped each of them by the hand like a protective father. They had never met Hades, but the Lord of the Underworld's reputation was well known to them. "I know it's customary to bring a cake to the dead woods, but I thought you'd forgive the oversight under the circumstances," Hades said, motioning to Circe. "What I'm bringing is so much better." "What happened to Circe, and why did you raise our dead?" Hazel was holding fast to Jacob's hand, and Primrose could see she was afraid to rush towards Circe, but she was clearly not too afraid to question this god who had appeared so suddenly in their courtyard. Hades laughed, revealing his rictus smile and sharp dagger teeth. "I have no need to make a display of my power within your kingdom, dear ladies. It is the return of your queen here who brings the dead to life, but I would be happy to add to the splendor of this auspicious occasion." He raised his hands and stretched them skyward, like a dramatic stage actor about to recite the greatest of soliloquies. "All hail, Queen Circe, our divine ruler of the dead woods." His booming voice rang out, but before he could continue, something distracted him. Annoyed by the interruption, he directed his attention to the distraction. Glowing spirits of the previous queens of the dead woods were rising from the earth, floating through the trees and in and out of their branches. They circled the endless graves and the statues that adorned them, then rose to the heights of the mansion, swirling up to the glass solarium. The spirits danced in the Gorgon fountain, wove among the legions of the dead, and paused at each gargoyle, raven, and harpy statue as if to say hello, like children happy to see their home again. They danced on the breeze, rejoicing, until finally they landed in the courtyard. The dark queens who had once ruled this land, now wraiths made of shadow, stood before Hades, their eyes glowing white and their mouths like black pits. These dark queens spoke to Hades as one, their voices filling the courtyard and making the trees wither and lose their blooms and green foliage with each word they spoke. "Lord of the dead, we thank you for returning Circe to us, but you are not welcome here." The sound of the wraith queen stirred Circe from her sleep. She sat up and opened her eyes, taking everything in. Once she seemed to realize where she was angry. "Where are my mothers? How dare you rip me from the place between?" She tried to stand, but was too unsteady and disoriented. "Really? Not even a thank you?" Hades said, putting his hand on his hip, his tentacles swishing like the tail of an annoyed cat. "I saved your life, little queen, and if you recall, your mothers are no longer your mothers. They are one mother, singular, One, just Lucinda. Remember? You fused them together, and she's angrier than, well, me on a bad day. Hades reached out his hand to help Circe stand, but she didn't take it. She was clearly still angry with Hades for whatever happened in the place between. Primrose couldn't glean the events from either of their minds, so she would just have to wait until she could talk to Circe. Thank you, Circe said, bracing herself against the angel statue and glaring at Hades as she stood. I can stand on my own. Tell me, why is a god intervening in the lives of witches? Why bring me here against my will? Why risk breaking the worlds in the process? Because a long time ago, I made a deal with your mothers. Years ago, I told them they could have any wish in exchange for something they did for me. And it seems, after all these years, they decided to call in their favor. They wanted you out of the place between, so I brought you here. Simple as that. I am a hellion of my word, after all. His smile was friendly, with a bit of cheekiness thrown in for good measure. He was doing his best to be charming. It wasn't a stretch. He was charming, but Primrose could see he was, as they say, on his best behavior. Believe me, little witch, you're better off here, where you can stay clear of your mother's wrath until you decide what you want to do, said Hades, looking around the dead woods with a deep sigh, like he was happy to be there. This was not what Primrose had expected from the Lord of the Underworld. She, Circe, and Hazel just stood there blinking at him, trying to take everything in. But before any more could be said, they caught something stirring in their peripheral vision. It was Lucinda's silhouette in the center of the vortex. Her ringlets were tangles, and her dark-circled eyes peered at them from her blood-stained face. Her body was oddly misshapen and contorted as she emerged from the swirling blue light on her hands and knees, screaming in agony as her bones audibly cracked and snapped. The Wraith Queens flew to her aid, dragging her through the vortex until finally she lay in a heap at the feet of a massive weeping angel on the other side. The angel looked as if she were protecting Lucinda under the cover of her wings. As Lucinda let out a horrifying chorus of misery, with Ruby's and Martha's voices joining hers, creating an aria of agony. Lucinda writhed in torment as her body violently seized. When she suddenly stopped moving, the Wraith Queens gathered around, whispering in her ears. Fear washed over Primrose and Hazel as Lucinda finally rose to her feet, the Wraith Queen's holding up her limp body. She looked like an old doll, broken and lifeless. What is happening? What's wrong with her? Circe cried. But Hades quickly put himself in front of her as Lucinda's limp body was again infused with rage and lunged at her daughter. Lucinda was clawing and reaching for Circe, but she couldn't get past Hades. He was an unmovable force, too strong even for Lucinda's torrent of anger. Do you think I would let you harm your daughter after everything you sacrificed to create her? But Lucinda didn't answer Hades. She was singularly focused on Circe. Look at me, Lucinda hissed, still trying to grab Circe, locking her eyes on her daughter as she screamed at her. You did this to me. I am in torment because of you. My sisters are digging their way out of me, clawing at my insides, scratching at my soul, wanting nothing more than to escape my body, the prison you put me in, all so they can kill you. I didn't mean for this to happen, I swear. Do not pretend you didn't wish for this. The Wraith Queen's faces were full of rage as the wind whipped around them. You are not the first daughter of the dead woods to betray her mother, they said as they swirled around everyone in the courtyard, lashing at their faces and whispering incantations on the wind. I am not the first mother to destroy her daughter. Lucinda's voice was full of purpose as she raised her hands, causing a shockwave of power and sending the Wraith Queen's spirits to disperse into black dusk, which scattered throughout the dead woods. You vile hags! I didn't ask for your help. Withdraw from this place at once, and leave my daughter to me, said Lucinda, raising her arms in declaration. Hear my words. I will break the worlds and watch my wretched daughter languish in despair as she witnesses the destruction of everyone and everything she holds dear. I will see the destruction of this kingdom before I give it over to these usurpers, these impostor witches, these so-called queens of the dead. All will suffer in my wake and know the true meaning of despair. Hades rolled his eyes theatrically and clapped. Wow, that was quite a speech. Do you think we can move this along with a little less monologuing? I've had enough of Greek tragedies, if you know what I mean. How dare you! You side with Circe after everything my sisters and I have done for you? You have meddled with our lives for the last time, devil. No, not even you can keep her safe from me. That's enough, said Hades, grabbing Lucinda by her disheveled ringlets and effortlessly tossing her through the vortex, closing it with a snap of his fingers. "And I thought my family was bad," he said. "I had no idea how Shakespearean your mothers had become." They all looked at him puzzled. "Come on now, the Scottish play? Everyone knows about the witches in the Scottish play, or is that too far from your time?" "I thought witches saw all time at once. Not there yet? Never mind. It's refreshing, really. I really hate to know it all anyway." Hades said, wiping the blood off his robes. "I'd say it's time for introductions. Of course, you know who I am. I am the legendary Lord of the Dead, and I had the pleasure of meeting Circe in the place between, before Lucinda demanded I take her away. I take it you're the famous Primrose and Hazel? Come, isn't anyone going to offer me some tea? The hospitality in these lands is legendary, and I think I could use some after all that drama." The Queens of the Deadwoods didn't know what to make of Hades. He wasn't at all what they expected, but they did know one thing. They were curious to hear what he was doing there.